25% could do better, and only 2 people aren't even thinking about it. So this is a pretty engaged group of people. All right. Let me, can't see the results. All right. Let me do one more poll just to check in and see how you're doing. Let me see if I can find poll number 2. Okay, this is my favorite poll. How are you holding up? Doing fine, ready to reimagine the future, trying to stay motivated, struggling a bit, down in the dumps. And the second one, and of course, is are you here tonight? This is the one that we're going to use to count toward attendance, which matters again. The students know that their grades have automatically been moved to pass, no pass, and they can still opt for a letter grade. Well, Aria, I am going to try to make you the host, but I have to share my screen. So we need to send Zoom a request that they make it possible for co-hosts to admit people. Here is the results from how people are doing. So I talked to a number of students this week on my office hours, and one of the common pieces of feedback was that people were trying to stay motivated, and they were having a hard time just doing everything virtually, and that they were really missing the peer-to-peer kind of interaction and pep talks. And so that's really tough. And I see that this week more people are struggling a bit than last week. This is certainly going to be a long haul for things. I brought you a slide to share with you about, let's see, I can find it. Brought a slide. Let's see, I'm gonna turn that off. Brought you, let's see. Brought a slide to, can you, let's see if I can share my, I don't know if I'm sharing my screen right now. Ari, am I sharing my screen?
Oh, not yet.
Not yet, okay.
No.
See what happened here. Okay, share screen, this one. Okay, so I wanted to share with you, I read in the New York Times this week that what are the indicators to know when we might get back to normal, and governors are thinking about this on a state-by-state level, and also communities are thinking about this on a state-by-state level, but there's sort of 4 criteria that we should all be looking for that will help us understand more when we might be getting back to a state of some semblance of normality or functionality. So the first is that hospitals in the state must be able to safely administer to all patients requiring hospitalization without resorting to crisis standards of care. The second one is a state or community needs to be able to at least test everyone immediately who has symptoms. The third criteria is the state is able to conduct monitoring of active cases. So we need to be able to know who's got a confirmed case and who they're in contact with. Now, some countries like Israel instituted a very assertive approach to using the whole mobile phone network and technology to track people. Of course, this brings up various privacy and issues that call to question the nature of democracy. So you can expect that as we use more technology to monitor, will also be coming in contact with a lot of privacy issues. And there must be a sustained reduction in cases for at least 14 days. Now, in some places, it appears that we may be approaching that moment of sustained reduction in cases. Certainly, the curve appears to be flattening in several communities in the Bay Area, thankfully. However, there are hotspots emerging, elsewhere. Anyway, I just wanted to share this because I thought it was interesting, and everybody's kind of asking themselves when is this going to break? When is this going to change? So I thought it was helpful to know that there are actual criteria being adopted by the CDC and the World Health Organization and governments. And it is something that's quantitative and something that we can track. And it's also something that we can actually participate in. This week, I was going to model my new mask for you, but maybe I'll do that next week. We sewed masks over the weekend, but now we're being asked to wear masks. And there's a very good article. I'm going to ask Fiona to share it in today's New York Times that shows the proper way to wear a mask. The only challenge is it makes eating very, very difficult. Well, tonight's class is being moderated by, or curated, I should say, by Nisha Balaram, who is one of our members of our teaching team. And Nisha put a lot of thought into this topic and inviting our guests. And I wanted to invite her to introduce herself briefly and give you a little bit of background on why this was an important topic to her, how her own educational work and career have sort of intersected with this topic, and what might you expect. And then I'm going to ask her to immediately introduce Dana Gunders, one of my favorite food systems change makers, who I'm just delighted to have here tonight. I also just want to say quickly, thank you very much to our speakers who are taking time away from their families and their Passover Seders. We always ask the question, why is tonight different than every other night? And there are many reasons for that, but one of them is that many people are celebrating Passover on Zoom tonight. So we're going to let Dan and Dana go to their families right after they speak with us tonight. So Nisha, take it away, please.
Thank you so much, and hi everybody. I'll keep this brief because I know time, in a good way, time passes by quickly in this class. As you might have seen me sitting in the audience with you, I'm one of the readers. I'm on the teaching team this semester, and I'm a second-year graduate student at the Graduate School of Journalism here at UC Berkeley. And I worked with Will last semester as a graduate student researcher, and we worked on designing the syllabus to not only be interactive for students, but really, in the present moment and engaging to allow for the best possible scenario for students to think about how to act on what they're envisioning. Just on a personal level, I feel that the issues of food waste and plastic waste are very personal. I remember when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, I noticed, in terms of like behavior change, we have certain habits around food and plastic that we have gained maybe from family and friends. And I think that when you find yourself in the world surrounded by peers, we can adopt behaviors from others and reinforce those and gain habits unintentionally. And I remember being an undergraduate and, taking too much food at the dining halls or taking a lot of takeout food and not being mindful around plastic. And I really think that with this class and learning more about systems, it's a really big wake-up call for what we can do as individuals to affect those around us. In terms of myself being in the journalism school, I find that the role of media and journalists is very important because you can report on a local issue, but it's connected to a system. And in the case of food and plastic waste, any innovation, no matter how small, has the potential to have widespread impact. And I think as someone who formerly worked in the public policy space, these issues are very much issues of racial justice. And I also feel that environmental justice is racial justice. So there's a lot of ways to access power and privilege through these issues. In this current moment, I know personally we talk about food waste. I just wanted to give a shout out to, and I know that Sandra may touch upon this, just the amount of plastic that may be coming into circulation, especially around, plastic gloves, materials for masks, the issue of reusable bags, whether or not you can use them in grocery stores. I just want to acknowledge that things are changing a lot, and I feel that this panel of leaders, and Will and Fiona helped me curate it, really represent systems leaders that are being flexible in the moment and really trying to avert crisis. And I think that it's not only a local issue, but in working with, I know Sandra through like my internship process at school, that it's a very global issue and that other countries really feel the impact of poor decisions that we make here on a local level. That being said, feel free to reach out to me via email, not only for the students, if you have any issues around mental health, grading concerns, etc. I'm available, as well as Fiona. And I just want to introduce Dana. I actually learned about Dana through Will. I'm going to bring up a quote here. She was considered, and I quote, "the woman who helped start the waste-free movement," according to Consumer Reports. And she is the current executive director of ReFed. And I know that she is probably going to review kind of her role and what ReFed is, but it's basically an organization that really pushes the needle around not only what data there is around waste, but also how can businesses, government funders, and nonprofits really work together in a coalition to reduce food waste at scale. And so without further ado, thank you for the bit of time. I want to pass it over to Dana. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisha. And Will, I think you're going to bring up some slides during this.
Sure, I will.
Whenever I can just kind of kick off here, because I wasn't going to go to them. Thank you all for taking time out. I'm honored to be part of the virtual entertainment that exists out there in the ether these days. And to take a moment to talk about something that I've actually been working on for about a decade now. And my story, I know Will always likes for people to kind of tell their stories of getting into what they get into as part of this class. So I'll just start by talking about, let's see, in about 2009, when I was working at a group called the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. It's a big environmental nonprofit. I've always kind of been an environmentalist. As a child, I slept on the floor so that all of my stuffed animals had a nice spot on the bed. And have been sort of in the environmental corridor ever since. And I was working at NRDC on a sustainable agriculture project with the fruit and vegetable industry, and looking at different aspects of sustainability on farms. And I was actually put in charge of the group to look at waste. And when they were talking about waste, they were really talking about like all the plastic that's involved in farming, the irrigation piping that gets ripped up and things like that. But as part of that, I started doing research for that. I started to stumble upon these numbers of how much food was going to waste, and reading crazy numbers like, oh my goodness, 40% of all the food in this country is never eaten. And at the time, the number was 25% of all the water in this country is going to grow food that's never eaten. And I just felt like, this is crazy. If these numbers were true, we would all be talking about them, and nobody is talking about them. And so that really kind of lit a fire for me. I had studied energy efficiency as kind of my focus area in school, and it felt like a real parallel for the food system to be working on kind of not wasting so much, and yet nobody was really doing it at the time. And that led me to write a report back in 2012 that in some ways kind of really sparked a dialogue. I was pretty young at the time, and I had no expectations for this report that I wrote. And within a day, it landed on CNN's breaking news headlines and kind of circled the globe in headlines for days. And I found myself on nightly news and not really kind of knowing what to do with all of that, but it got a lot of attention, and that sparked a dialogue that kind of just kept going. And frankly, it was like drinking out of a fire hose. People were super interested in it. We got calls from Walmart and USDA and all sorts of others who were kind of really shocked by the numbers and wanted to do something about it. So that was back in 2012, and I've essentially been really working on this issue ever since. I wrote a book called The Waste-Free Kitchen Handbook that is really about how you waste less in your homes, and pulled several other projects together as well. And now I work, as Nisha was saying, at an organization called ReFed. We are wholly dedicated to reducing food waste within the US, and we focus on solutions that are data-driven. And oops, I left an extra slide in there. You can just skip on down, well, a couple. So I just kind of wanted to give you, and Will asked me to really set the context for this conversation and just almost like the basics on what food's going to waste, why, you know, some of the big information around it. And so you can go on, Will, to the next one. When we talk about food going to waste, oh, you go back one sec, because I never like to miss it.
Yeah, that one's not showing up, unfortunately.
Oh, it's not. Okay. Well,
I'm sorry.
That's fine. When we talk about food going to waste, you know, it's complicated. There are little bits and pieces that go to waste in every little corner of the food system. But I think for me, it really hits home when you see a photo like this. And this is a dumpster of perfectly good hummus that is actually 3 weeks before the date on the package. And we actually don't know why this was all going to waste, but it was captured in a documentary called Just Eat It, looking at, yes, and it just kind of grabs your heart. There are areas where there's just huge volumes of food going to waste, and then there are areas where it's really about, you know, the science experiment in the back of your fridge, and poor meal planning. And as Will kind of said in the poll, or I think people got it right. Did we get the results from that question? I can't remember. But households are actually the #1 source of food waste. So despite the fact that you do find little caches of like this happening, it's actually all 329 million of us in our homes wasting little bits here and there. That adds up to the most food going to waste. Go ahead, Will. So just to cover some of like the big numbers that you may have seen around, about 40% of all the food in the food system is never eaten. Some numbers start at 30. It kind of depends what you're counting. It's a really challenging thing to actually get data on, but either way, it's a giant amount. And if you go to the next slide, it has huge implications for, oh, keep going there. Some of these oh, they're not showing up. That's okay. It has huge implications.
It's not loading your slides. I really apologize for that. I have no idea why that's the case, but
no worries. I know these numbers pretty well. So yeah, it is a huge loss of nutrition, as you see on this slide. 141 trillion calories. That's equivalent to about the full diets of 50 million Americans. I'm sorry, a third of 141 trillion calories is equivalent to the full diets of 50 million Americans, which is actually greater than the number considered food insecure. I'm not going to say today with everything going on, but as of a few months ago. So huge quantities, just to kind of give you a sense of scope. On the environmental side, you know, agriculture is one of the biggest users of resources in our country. And every time we throw something away, essentially those resources are for naught. And so we have about 20% of all of the fertilizer, cropland, agricultural water that we use in this country going to grow food that never gets eaten. And then on the climate side, if any of you are familiar with Project Drawdown, they actually just redid their analysis. It's an analysis of now 76 solutions to climate change. Reducing food waste is actually now ranked #1 on their list, above solar, wind, all sorts of transportation solutions. And the reason for that is primarily because it takes so much to grow food. And there's actually quite a few greenhouse gases associated with certainly standard methods of food production. And then if you add that to everything it takes to transport, cool, cook, store food, it adds up to quite a bit. And then when we throw that food away, when it lands in the landfill, it actually releases methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, many times the warming potential of carbon dioxide. So there's kind of impacts around the system. And a lot of times people will ask, well, yeah, but if I don't eat the noodles on my plate, we're not going to ship them to Africa or whatever you want to say. But I would say that the big picture, so no, you're not going to kind of ship the food off your plate to Africa. But what we're really after here is a more efficient food system that can feed people with fewer resources. And the UN predicts that we will actually need anywhere from 50 to 80%, the numbers keep updating, more food to feed our population in 2050 than we have right now. And so our choices are to go out there and grow more food, or else we can start using the food that we are producing better. And I think that's really what we're after, is to have more efficient systems that make the best use of our food. The IPCC, which is a big climate, I'm sure many of you are familiar, it's a big body that kind of, whatever, the authoritative body on the science of climate change. They came out with a report last year around land use and agriculture. And reducing food waste was actually one of the only solutions that both mitigated climate change because it reduced emissions, but also they offered up as a solution to adaptation. So where they're expecting there to be more food shortages due to drought, floods, and other disasters, they see that if we can, dial our food system in to be more efficient, that it can actually help adapt to some of those disasters. Can go on there. Well, one thing that's nice about this, I suppose, is that it has a real economic argument to it. So we spend $218 billion, where we throw out about $218 billion. That's just here in the US. And you can see kind of, as I was mentioning, where that lands, that homes are really the highest quantity there. And then go ahead, well, and then in volume as well, that homes and consumer-facing businesses, so restaurants, grocery stores, and you can see the breakdown there below on this slide as to where it's happening. I see really probably the area I see the most immediate opportunity is in the food service and restaurant sector, and then on farms. On farms, a lot of times food is going to waste for two main reasons. One is it doesn't meet the specs that are written out for it. So when grocery stores or big restaurant chains are buying food, they will specify, the size and color and all of that. And a lot of food just doesn't grow that way and doesn't meet those specs. The other thing is that they can suffer from really low prices, where it actually costs more to harvest food than it does than the price they can fetch for it. So those are kind of two of the main reasons you see losses on farms, and I see a lot of opportunity there. One other I'll highlight for you, and I won't walk through the whole supply chain because I don't think we have time this evening, but one other is restaurants and actually plates. So we have a portion challenge in this country, and there's sort of a presumption that quantity equals value. So people have this mindset of kind of how much pasta they should get for $10, right? And if you go into a store or a restaurant and you pay a certain amount, you kind of expect a certain quantity. And so you find that in food service, restaurants are kind of competing often on quantity among other things and volume. And so they are motivated to provide a lot of fillers on a plate, and that can make it look like you have big portions, but you don't necessarily get eaten. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in that particular wedge to do something there. Those are just two. We'll talk about some more later. So just a few ways that you can kind of wrap your head around this. A lot of times I'll talk about food waste when people say, oh, I compost, which is great because composting is absolutely the best thing to do with food scraps that are not edible any longer and you can't do anything else with them. But it's not necessarily why we grow our food and put so many resources into getting it to our table. And so the EPA has actually set up this hierarchy, they call it, that essentially is like the reduce, reuse, recycle of food waste. And so what it says is, first, let's not have a lot of excess food. Let's be so efficient that we don't even have that. And when you do, let's find ways to get it to people to eat, and if not people, animals. And only then let's think about solutions like composting or bioplastic solutions or other things like that. And of course, last resort being the landfill. Another way to kind of think about how to prioritize on this is resource use. So in this class, I'm sure you've already heard a lot about kind of the high intensity resource use that meat and dairy products have. Here, what you see are the equivalent in shower minutes of how much water it takes to produce each of these foods. So when you throw out a hamburger, it's actually the equivalent of taking a 90-minute shower in terms of the water it took to produce that hamburger, whereas a tomato is 5 and a banana 42 here. So we can start by really being careful with the meat and dairy choices we make, both in our homes and businesses. And then lastly, I often get asked about policy solutions, and I'll say that I think the most powerful ones we've seen yet have been around the end of life of food. So banning food from going to the landfill. Here in California, we actually have a pretty strong law that does not completely ban it, but it sets a really high target for avoiding food going to landfills. And then it also actually requires that 20% of all the edible food in the state be recovered for human consumption by starting in 2022. So the whole state is kind of reorganizing right now to be able to take a huge amount more food into the food donation system than before. So I'm just gonna pause because I see a couple of questions coming in, if that's all right, Will, and maybe sure. Should I take a moment to answer those as they come?
Sure, if you like to.
Okay.
I'm gonna give it to you.
I think now I'm not really seeing it.
One was, how do you exactly measure how much wasted food are coming from restaurants?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really hard to exactly measure how much wasted food is coming from anywhere, is the real truth. And if you kind of like think about it, what it takes, you have a bunch of food going into a dumpster somewhere. The dumpster gets picked up once a week, so you don't even know if that food's full. It can be a real challenge. So there are, most of the information we have are kind of small samples that have been analyzed for their contents, like very specifically, where somebody will take garbage cans and actually sort it into 12 buckets and see what all's in it, and then essentially extrapolate out from there. So that's kind of how most of the information on this gets gathered.
There's another question about, are there any regulations in place that prevent restaurants or grocery stores from donating food to food kitchens or for additional uses?
No, in fact, there is a regulation in place that's called the Good Samaritan Act. It's national. It's a federal regulation that actually protects anyone donating food in good faith to a nonprofit should anyone get sick. So there's pretty strong liability protections. In California, there's actually a set of protections on top of that protect anyone donating food to anyone else. So, if somebody comes to your door and you give them food, were they to get sick, you're actually protected from a liability standpoint as well.
Great. Do you want to go on with slides, Dana?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let me get back to the slides and see if I can share my screen again.
So when we look at, while you're doing that, I'll just give it a start. Well, you know, what to do is a really complicated question. And I often say, you know, working on this issue is not just working on one issue. It's about how do you fix the food system. And that looks very different on a farm than it does in a restaurant, than it does in our home. And so you can go on to the next one, Will. At ReFed, ReFed actually did try to analyze many of the solutions that are out there. And what you see here is a chart with 27 different solutions and an estimate of how much they save in dollars actually on the vertical, and how much food they save, which is the width of the bar on the horizontal. So you can see that way up top, there's some real consumer-facing solutions here. And then as we go on, what you see sort of the really wide, small bars at the end are the ones that have really big volumes, but not a lot of economic value. And that's like your composting and your anaerobic digestion and things that you kind of do at the end of life with product. It's nice that for businesses, when they reduce the amount of food they're wasting in their own business, it saves money. And so some of these, you'll see that. This chart's a little bit, this is sort of grand economic value, so it's not always the money saved by the business implementing. And we have other charts if you go to refed.com, where you can analyze the solutions in different ways. And we're also working on a whole new generation of this analysis that will be coming out in the fall. But basically, you know, one way to think about how you solve this is, first of all, figuring out how much waste you have, you know, and what does that waste look like? How much, you know, how much of it is kind of designed into your life or your business? You know, is it just in your operation, or are you actually driving waste upstream in the way that you're buying product? Or are you driving it downstream in the way that you're selling product? And ultimately, where is it going? And is there a better, higher use once you have those food scraps for those scraps as well? And keep going, Will. Once you're there, enlisting staff is something we hear all the time. I mean, ultimately, a lot of these solutions boil down to behavior. And so giving staff the motivation to really drive change and understand why it's important that they cut a broccoli in the way you're asking them to, or follow other protocols, is critical, because a lot of it does boil down to very unsexy details around, you know, managing cold chains and how you're serving products and things like that. And so really getting your people on board is critical. And I believe strongly in setting short-term goals. There is a federal goal that matches a UN goal to cut food waste by 50% by 2030 out there. And you'll hear that cited a lot, and that's fantastic and very ambitious. And I'm totally on board with that happening, but I think it's really hard to do anything on a 10-year time frame like that when you're talking about a perishable product that lasts 3 weeks. And so setting short-term goals, I think, is a really important key strategy to getting there. And then, you know, from that, trying to figure out what solutions work in your business, in your life, wherever your sphere of influence is, in the wedding you're planning, in the whatever it is, you know, where are the solutions? And asking the questions of people you're buying food from, and really trying to understand what works in your particular situation. Just to give you examples of a few key solutions here, this is for a grocery level. I think forecasting, you know, the more grocery stores can dial into exactly how much product they're going to sell, the less food they're going to waste in their stores. It's kind of that simple in theory. It's really difficult in practice. You have grocery stores managing about 50,000 different SKUs of products, different types of items, and managing that much inventory in all sorts, you know, 1,000 different stores is very complicated. There's some pretty exciting machine learning being applied to forecasting these days that's showing real promise in terms of being able to help predict sales and identify patterns, purchasing patterns, much more accurately. Another solution, just back on that retail, is around dynamic pricing. So you'll see grocery stores marking product down. That's sort of the the old school way, like 50% off because this is about to go bad. Every grocery store in this country should be doing that. They aren't all. So tell your store if you don't see that, because it makes sense. And I think when you don't see them doing it, it's an image thing. They don't want to kind of be seen as a discount store, but it makes sense all around. And there's some higher tech ways of adjusting pricing more specifically, I would say, over time, that effectively are the new high-tech way of marking things down.
And I just got a question. We just have a few more minutes, and I know you want to get back to your family, and Dan's going to pop out of his Seder, so I want to see and figure out how to make the timing work. But I just got a question sent in saying, how much of the food that the U.S. wastes every year is attributed to things like recalls?
There are recalls, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge amount relative to some of the more systemic causes.
Okay, great.
There's some cool examples around packaged products, but I'll let Dan talk about upcycling and maybe just sort of skip over, because I want to get to what's going on today really quickly. I know you're probably curious. So you can keep going there. Well, so just this last one, and you could click through. There's a little animation here. There should be. I've been speaking a lot and just reading a lot around what is the impact today of COVID on the food system and on waste. Is there a lot of product going to waste? And the simple fact of the matter is that when you shut down half of the food system, food is going to go to waste. And I've been really amazed by how much effort a lot of food businesses are putting into making sure that the products that they had on hand as they were having to close really abruptly were being donated and things like that. But what you have is a whole supply chain that pretty much feeds food service that is now out of a sales channel. And so what we're seeing is grocery retail is surging hugely, and all of those companies that serve food service typically are trying to now find ways to sell into retail or direct to consumer. And direct to consumer is just exploding massively right now. And so they're really trying to find their way into there, but not everything's packaged in the same way. Not all the products are kind of equal. You have a lot of finer products that are sold in restaurants that people don't buy in the grocery store. So certainly some challenges, and it's going to be quite an interesting time for rebuilding the food system, to be honest.
Do you have any predictions about what may not return to business as normal? Have you thought ahead?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift is going to be a step change in direct to consumer, or otherwise known as online ordering. Those companies, one of the biggest challenges they have is getting people to try them one time, whether it's a produce box or Amazon Fresh or a meal kit. All of them, are offering a free box just so you'll try it that first time. Well, they are just, I know that where I live, the local food hub here has like 6 times its normal demand right now. And I have not spoken to a company that does direct to consumer yet that's not experiencing just volumes times what they're used to in ways that they're having to tell consumers no. So I don't know that all of those consumers will stick with it, but I know a portion of them will, certainly after doing it for months and kind of building that habit. And frankly, I think when it comes to food waste, there's a huge opportunity there to skip over some of the waste that happens in the supply chain, and also help consumers plan better in the process, which is a key solution at the consumer level. So I actually think that is a big step change, and it will have real potential to take down food waste a bit.
Some of the farmers that I've been working with in an entrepreneurship program have had to quickly pivot because they sell most of their production to, or at least maybe slightly more than half to specialty restaurants. Mm-hmm. And it's been interesting because they grow a lot of things that chefs know what to do with that your normal home cook doesn't. So some of the more creative restaurants have been putting the out of work chefs to work to offer kind of cooking classes to make this connection between the home and newly available produce that is perishable, highly perishable. But I've been really inspired by how rapidly these farmers have pivoted and how resilient the relationships that they have with their communities have responded. And there's a really interesting just codependence. The people who are the CSA members have all of a sudden enrolled lots of their friends in, to expand the CSA uptake of the perishable goods. So it's quite interesting what can happen. And I think all of a sudden people are getting more comfortable with, cooking at home, cooking with what's seasonal, cooking with what's local. I mean, not everyone, but certain people that have access. But these are farmers that are all over the country. So, but most of them are in near metropolitan areas. There's a couple other questions. I don't know if you can see them here in the chat, Dana, but
so read them out if that's easier.
Well, I'll take one that's kind of applicable for today around clever ways that transportation and storage challenges of matching food donations to those who need it are being conquered. On the transportation side, it's just a really active question right now because you have organizations, one right there in Berkeley called Replate, who, as an example, was picking up food from corporate campuses and kitchens, like leftover food from the, let's say, LinkedIn kitchen, and was taking it to a shelter, a soup kitchen, or a community organization. Well, now the corporate campus has closed and the community kitchen can't serve people on site anymore. And so they've now pivoted to picking up food from all these places that were closing, but then delivering it to people's homes. And that's been a real transportation challenge. And you're seeing that across the food assistance organizations that they're now being challenged to take food to people in their homes, or to pack food into things when they never had to pack it before. And so you have companies like DoorDash and Lyft who are now offering their drivers at cost to deliver some of that product. And so it's pretty interesting. There's a lot of people stepping up, but it's a huge new added challenge that didn't used to exist.
Well, Dana, as always, you've filled our minds with good data and lots of suggested possibilities. And I just want to encourage everyone to stay connected to ReFed and Dana's work. ReFed is such an interesting organization because it's really catalytic in terms of its outreach, its ecosystem. It's a very fascinating kind of new model for a nonprofit that stimulates a lot of entrepreneurial innovation and action in a lot of other organizations. So it's kind of a decentralized catalytic research and do tank, a think and do tank. So Dana, we're thrilled that you're leading the way there at ReFed now. That's just such a great combo to have you there. And I've always been a big fan of ReFed. And we're grateful to you to having joined us tonight on a special night. And we'll let you return to your family. And I'm going to thank Dana. There's a few other questions for her. Maybe you can answer them just in the chat if you have a few more minutes, or people got your email and they can send it directly. But in the interest of just trying to keep pace and have people get to their dinner tables at the right time, I'm going to thank Dana, and I'm going to turn it over to Dan Kurzrock. Dan is the CEO, co-founder of Regrained, really interesting, innovative company that is making delicious products from unused product flow in a manufacturing process. So Dan, why don't you take it away and tell us about Regrained, and just let me know when you'd like to see your slides and I will do my best to bring them up.
Awesome. That sounds great. Thanks, Will. Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Just quick confirmation. Yeah. Awesome.
Yep.
Thanks, Nisha. So yeah, great to be with you in this very strange time and format. I think these issues are more important now than they ever have been before. I'm here as, I believe, your kind of resident entrepreneur. I'll tell you a bit more about my business. Kind of crafted some slides for those of you who are maybe thinking about getting into the food business. They're kind of somewhere between, what I would maybe show to an investor and some content that's more geared towards this being a classroom, virtual classroom. And so what I think is a fun part of my story is that before anyone was talking about food waste, really, it was just kind of a common sense issue for a lot of years for those that paid attention to it. I did my undergrad at UCLA, where I actually started this business. So I started this as a kind of a hobby when I was in college, and it's now a full-time endeavor with a global presence. And so it's come a long way. Still got a long way to go, and we've got a whole new set of challenges to try and thrive through right now with everything that's going on. But always love the college environment, because that's really where we first put creativity into action with our endeavor. So thanks for having me. And I do have the chat open as well, so I'll try to be mindful of that. If you want to put it on the slides, I think we can start with those now.
There you go.
So we can just go to the next. Great logo, right? Okay.
Let me see if I can figure out how to advance this slide, Dan. Sorry.
Oh yeah, if you go to full screen, you should be able to just use your up and down arrows.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I have on my little computer is I cannot see the whole screen because it's covered up with things. Is that better? There we go. Can you see it now?
Yeah, I can see it. This is one of my latest kind of hooks that I put at the beginning of presentation. So it's what if the number one solution to climate change were also $1 billion opportunity. So as many of you likely know, food waste was just actually upgraded from the number 3 to the number 1 solution to climate change by Project Drawdown. And what's really incredible about the opportunity is that there's also, not for all of it, but for a big portion of it, which I'll be talking about today, there are significant for-profit ways to participate in both the solution and also build a business that can scale. So we'll get into a bit more there. Let's see what's on the next slide here. So Regrained, what do? We are the upcycled ingredient platform. We are leaders in the space, and that we're one of the first to start talking about this. I started the business as a hobby in college. I was an underage home brewer. I learned how to make beer when I was 19 in the spring quarter of my freshman year. And some of you might know, you can buy the ingredients to make beer. You can make the beer. Of course, we never drank it. We never endorsed that. But really love the hobby of producing, this, it was a craft, it was a home craft. And with every batch of beer, really discovered that I was also using a lot of grain. To make beer, you've got 4 ingredients: barley, water, hops, and yeast. And you're just taking the sugar from the grains to make the beer. What's left are all the residual proteins and fiber, and it's a solid. It's about a pound for every 6-pack. And so that's kind of what turned us onto this. We have a consumer brand that I'll talk a bit about. We've got products in Whole Foods, a nutrition bar, and we actually just launched the salty chip. And what I think is the most exciting thing about what we're building with Regrained is it started, you hear it in our name, it started with the grain from the beer brewing process. But it turns out that what we've invented from a kind of supply chain side, the technology, is applicable to a lot of other kind of overlooked, underutilized ingredients that are out there kind of hiding in plain sight. It's never made sense to waste food from a business case perspective. There are a lot of historical examples of what we now call upcycling, which is to put something to its highest use, its best use on that food recovery hierarchy that you guys saw earlier. And things like baby carrots, could be considered upcycled because the baby carrots aren't grown as baby carrots, right? They are just historically been imperfect carrots that have had value-added processing to then be marketed as baby carrots. Some would argue a less savory example could be a hot dog. Meat processors have always used everything but the squeal, right? And kind of a fun philosophical upcycling question of, is a hot dog upcycled? And for me, the way that you make that differentiation between kind of what's been historical common sense of just like making more money by creating co-products where you can, and upcycling is the philosophy behind it. And upcycling as a business model really has net environmental benefit as being core to its mission. It is common sense, traditional wisdom to use, all of everything and do more with less. It's good for the bottom line. But, the upcycle is to look at what's previously been overlooked by the industrialization of our food system and kind of identify these new areas of opportunity that, I've been kind of slipping through the cracks. All right, so let's see what's next. I probably talked about some of these things.
All right, Dan, I'm trying to switch it.
Yeah,
it turns out
like I ramble for like 3 minutes and then.
That's right. It turns out that when I, and I'm not making an excuse here, but if I click on the chat, then it takes me out of the screen. So I'm having to go. I can't monitor the chat and your slides at the same time right now. So.
No, absolutely no.
Well, I'm going to keep going. Just tell me how.
Yeah, I know this is So this is basically early on when we were homebrewing. It was really just one hobby to fund another hobby. I started baking bread and selling that bread to my friends to then buy more ingredients to brew more beer. And so it kind of I like to talk about this origin because it's not like we originally set out to try and be a huge champion for food waste solutions or really do much of anything besides feel good about a hobby that we loved. And something can start that simple and it can, kind of inflate, in scope beyond what you could have ever imagined in really exciting ways.
So did you were clearly focused on counting the grains. You were counting the profits. Were you counting carbs too?
I love carbs.
You must love carbs.
more the better. So speaking of counting, this is what it looks like on a commercial scale. This is actually the photo on the left I took on like an early generation iPhone, probably in 2012 or 13, outside of a craft brewery in San Francisco. This is you can see like 7 full-size dumpsters. Obviously, this isn't food safe handling, but full of grain that have been used to brew. This is from one day's production at one brewery. Just to, again, put it in kind of perspective, like let's just look at San Francisco. We should have mentioned earlier, we're a Berkeley-based business. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Now we're in Berkeley. But so in San Francisco, 7 miles by 7 miles, not a very big city, less than 1 million people, right? There's about 40 breweries, more breweries than neighborhoods. There's about more than 2 new breweries opening per day, right? So if you just think about the sheer volume of this grain, it's tens of billions of pounds a year that are used only for its sugars to make beer. And best case for what happens to it today, I learned at an industrial scale, is that it's used for animal feed, feeding cattle and maybe used for compost. Urban breweries have a unique problem, which is where we really started to get into it, where we learned that a lot of urban breweries were actually paying to have it hauled away as waste because they needed to get it out so that they could make more beer. So it's kind of handled in different ways in different places, but what we're trying to do is promote the best use. The best use for food is to feed people. And so by keeping this in the food system, much like having a plant-based diet is better for the environment, this is putting our resources to best use. So what we are, in terms of resources, so it takes about 1 pound of grain to make 1 6-pack of beer. That's kind of the rough heuristic to have in mind. And in the beer making process, it uses a lot of water. Most of that water is in the agricultural supply chain of the grain. So it's the equivalent of about 300 gallons of water used to make just 1 6-pack of beer. That's more than a 2-hour shower for 1 6-pack of beer. And most of that to grow and process grain that's only needed by beer for its sugars. So we're saying, hey, let's do the best that we can with what's left. To do this, we actually, we knew we had a great idea. We weren't really sure how to scale it. I mean, we were business students, undergrad, economics students. This grain, when it comes out of the brewery, it's very wet. This has been the challenge with a lot of these byproducts that could potentially be co-products, is that they can be difficult to process, energy intensive, to do it in a food safe way that's actually scalable. we knew we had an idea on the demand side, if you think of it as a market, but on the supply side, we weren't really sure, how we could do this, at large volumes, because a single brewery is putting out tons of this stuff a day. So we actually learned about the USDA ARS. It's in Albany, very close to campus, right on the other side, actually, of the graduate student housing. They have the Western Regional Research Center is right there. And they have a team that's dedicated to creating novel ingredients out of plant-based waste, which is a really incredibly academic way to describe upcycling. And so we worked with them. I actually need to update the slide. The patent was approved. We actually we were looking for something that we could buy that would work to do this. We couldn't find anything, so we invented something together and filed a patent, and that's now kind of critical IP that's powering our whole business. Our business model is to create these supply chains using our technology, apply culinary arts and food science to figure out what we can do with it. So just because something can be used, how should it be used is really the question. The way we scale is through selling ingredients to other food companies. So we've got, you think of it like a flour that can be used to make all kinds of stuff that can be sold. And we've got active projects going on with a lot of, both big and small companies and regional bakeries. Actually, if you go to Market Hall Foods in Oakland, you can get a pasta that they make. They have 2 pastas that they make with our flour. And then what most people would know us for today is our brand. So we make consumer packaged goods that we sell through to places like Whole Foods and things like that. And that exists as a way to help build the market. So we got to educate people about these new ingredients, these new supply chains, what's so great about them from a nutrition perspective, flavor, the environment impact as well. And so that we use our brand as a way to do that and also generate cash today, because these sales cycles are long. So if you can name it, we've probably regrained it. This is a picture of just some things that we've done in our R&D kitchens and with our partners, kind of from cooking. What we've been really surprised by is how versatile it is. I had a product developer share a milk with me recently, I think like Oatly, that was made with our ingredient. It was incredible. Never would have guessed that we could make a beverage until I tasted this. And it's a lot of fun because it means that we need to try and prioritize as much as we can too, because there are a lot of different ways that we could sell this through. Let's see what's next. We can kind of skip just brief. Well, we can leave it up, and I'm not going to read through these statistics, but bottom line is on the consumer side right now, people are very focused on products that are better for the planet, and they're willing to pay more for them. And more so as they get educated about upcycling, they've indicated that they want to do their part, and that's bodes well for the movement that we're trying to build, which is market driven. We have 2 product lines. This is the new one that just launched. It'll take a while to hit stores with everything that's going on right now. So we're doing direct to consumer mostly right now through our website and Amazon, and Imperfect Foods is a great partner of ours as well. This is a puff, and we got a bar. Happy to talk to anyone who's interested in CPG outside of this class, but it's our way of bringing things to market faster and educating as many people as possible about the full potential that's out here. We can skip this. How am I doing on time? Probably too long, right?
Got a few minutes.
CPG is consumer packaged goods. I'm sorry, I need jargon police. Thank you, Ella, for asking that. It's unavoidable. Packaging question. Yeah, I want to talk about this. So
consumer packaged goods.
Yeah, the P in CPG is the dirty word. We have a lot of resources on our website. If you just look up regrained and compostable packaging, this has been something that's been a huge focus and personal passion of mine. We had a massive issue about a year ago where we discovered that our products were actually going stale as a result of our compostable packaging. So what we were trying to do was not create packaging waste while we were preventing food waste. And what we ended up doing is creating food waste by preventing packaging waste. And packaging is I could do a whole thing on it. So I would love
Sandra, our next guest, is going to talk exactly about that. So
great.
It's a great segue.
Yeah, it's a super important issue. There's a lot of work. The short of it is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the technical side of things to create packaging that's actually viable, that is that is also planet friendly. And what I want to see also is more of the conversation shifting towards the supply chain for plastics as well. So compostable and landfill, those are end of life language, recyclable end of life language, right? Plant-based inputs as opposed to petroleum inputs, is a part of the conversation that I don't think is getting enough attention today. Nutritionally too, someone asked about that. This is just a bread recipe, so you can see what it does to that. It's got significantly more protein than an alternative flour, than like a traditional flour, excuse me. But the big nutritional value of brewer's grain is in fiber, both dietary and prebiotic. It's really good for digestive health. It's also got great flavor and some functional properties for product developers that they appreciate.
So in the flour shortage in the grocery store, are you selling a product now? I mean, it would seem like a great opportunity.
You're the second person to ask me that today, actually. No, we do not have our flour set up as a consumer-facing product. It would be a great time to do that, I think. I can't even I make bread at home, and I can't even, we can't find flour anywhere. So right. Yeah, that's a missed
maybe later tonight you can invent that product line.
Yeah, so that's a missed opportunity for us. Andrea, I would love to talk to you about that later. So I wanted to go through just a few other examples. Is the grain mostly barley? Yeah, so we source grain that's 95% barley. Barley is traditionally what you use to make beer. Some of the larger breweries, one of them uses rice and corn. The other one uses, if there's a Super Bowl ad that they use sugar, the sugar in the beer. It's not that there's sugar being added to the beer like a soda. It's that sugar is used as a fermentable sugar that's added, that is barley derived and just inexpensive. Yeah, so what we're doing is we make a consistent blend and that uses mostly barley.
Where do you want to go with the slides now, Dan?
Yeah, so the rest of these are just, and we can go to questions if that's best. The rest of these slides are other examples of upcycling. Just pickles. Excuse me, preserves. These are examples of the old wisdom for value-added foods. But then what can we do when we say, nose to tail? I'm gonna have a sip of water here.
And then we'll turn it over to Sandra in just a minute, Dan.
Yeah, I think let's advance. See what I'll talk about a few of these. We can skip this one. You can skip that one. Skip that one. Coffee, I love this example. So coffee, we're used to the bean, right? That's what we drink. We drink roasted coffee beans. The coffee is a fruit. There's actually a cherry that is wrapped around that fruit. If anyone's been to coffee producing regions in the world, you've probably seen these red berries on the trees. Typically discarded, they rot in a big pile, pollute waterways. They don't get used for a whole lot. There's a number of ways that it's called. It's also known as cascara, or this coffee fruit, which is very high in antioxidants and caffeine. Can be used. We use it in our chocolate flavored bar, or chocolate coffee bar. It's got caffeine, antioxidants. There's a lot of potential there. Let's skip the next one, and I think it's the one after that. Cacao, also chocolate, right? We all love chocolate. Also a bean that we're used to consuming. There's fruit around that. And this is one company. They started with a juice. Now they're doing sweeteners for as an ingredient supplier. Actually, really tasty, really interesting. Unique fruit that a lot of people don't know about. And we can skip this one. I bring up these examples because it's, so Forager, we know them for juice, pulp. You have a lot of pulp left over from juice. They actually use their pulp in their own line of chips. It used to be a bigger product line. I think they've trimmed down their offerings on this recently, but I think it's really clever how they position it. They talk about it as being pressed vegetables. So much of upcycling effectively is about not yucking the customer's yum while also communicating the value of what you're doing. And then, my favorite, what I hope is an inspiring example and end to this is toast. They take bread and they turn it back into beer, actually replacing some of the barley used to brew beer with surplus bread, which is the largest waste, by volume coming out of the grocery stores. I believe is the stat. A lot of food banks can't take bread. A lot of bread is overproduced. It's really difficult to inventory plan, and there's just massive amounts of it. It turns out you can actually replace some of the grain bill in a beer recipe, with a percentage of these breads. And so it's kind of from full circle, right? We were eat your beer, and there drink your toast, and I think it kind of bookends, this really this philosophy that we have as upcyclers, that it's a community. What we're trying to do is rally together, come up with innovative solutions that can change up business as usual, because as it relates to food waste, business as usual sucks, and there's a lot of opportunity to make an impact and also make a buck in doing that. So I appreciate.
And one question
Yeah.
for you: how do you go from being like an economics major to an entrepreneur? How do you do that?
For us, for me, it was kind of a slow and steady process. So I started with it as a hobby. So I made my hobby revenue generating,
Mm-hmm.
and we incorporated the business. Timing was good, and that we could be a cottage foods organization in 2013, which was the year after I graduated from undergrad. So we're actually able to register the business and do farmers markets, and kind of saw it as a way to test out the idea before we took the plunge. And I think with the kind of kernel there that I hope you take away is that the way that you do it is you just take action on your ideas. A lot of people get really caught up in making sure that they have the perfect product or the perfect business model, or and all models are wrong. Some are useful, but all are wrong. And so I think it's really just, if you got a good idea that's good for the world, it's just about starting to do it and get yourself out there and ask for help, and you'll hold yourself subject to improvement over time, and hopefully it's successful. That's what I've been doing this whole time. But it all just started with the idea and doing something about it.
We're grateful that you've been with us tonight. I'm going to ask you to come back to campus when it's open again, and
Anytime.
come to Food Innovation Studio, and we can dive a little deeper into product design and the whole cycle and life cycle analysis and that kind of stuff. So this is a great prelude in terms of our next speaker, Sandra Curtis. Sandra is with the Plastics Pollution Council. She's in charge of special projects. We just learned that Sandra actually has a little bit of internet challenge tonight, so she's here with us on the phone. So what I'm going to try to do is get her teed up with the slides that she sent me. Sandra, are you there? Can you say hello on the phone?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Oh, fantastic. Good.
Okay, great.
So you and I will do this kind of blind mime.
Well, I think we'll be okay because, I've got the slides numbered and I can,
Okay.
I think we'll get our cues clear.
Do you want me to bring up your slides right now?
Sure.
Okay,
That would be great.
Let me find them. Hold on just a second. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about you and what you do, and then I'll get your slides teed up and I'll let you know when that's
Sure.
ready to go.
So first, let me say thank you to Nisha for inviting me, and Will. It's a pleasure to be part of this very, very cool class. I never got to take a neat class like this when I was an undergrad. And it's great that there's so many community members that are part of this. As Will said, my name's Sandra Curtis, and our organization is called Plastic Pollution Coalition. My role is, I think, rather enviable. My title is the Director of Innovative Projects, but as our CEO and co-founder, Deanna Cohen, describes my work, she says, oh, she just gets to go find things she's interested in around plastic pollution and then just go do them, which is pretty much true. I get to innovate interesting projects and move us into places that fit along the lines of what our mission is. So the organization, Dan, I'm not sure if you're on slide number 2 at this point.
Yeah, on slide
but
2.
Who are we? As it says, we were founded in 2009, and our mission is focused on reducing specifically single-use plastic, and plastic pollution and its toxic effects on life and then on the environment. At this point in time, we've had a lot of growth over the almost 6 years that I've been with the organization. We're proud founding members of the Break Free from Plastic Global Movement. So next slide. Some of you may be of my generation and remember the movie The Graduate. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's definitely a moment in history. But Mr. McGuire wants to give the recent college graduate, Benjamin, some advice, and he says one word: plastic. And then he says there's a great future in plastic. So next slide. So the question is, what's a brief look about where we've moved with plastic? From the late 50s through the early 80s and on to, next slide, where this has taken us. It's pretty much a global crisis, and some of you may be shocked by these pictures and others of you may have seen ones like this, but it's really taken a heavy toll in a mere 60 years. By one estimate, almost 80% of all plastic that was ever produced is now either in a dump or a landfill or somewhere strewn in the environment. And only, I'm not sure if this number will shock you, but less than 10% of plastic has ever been recycled. Next slide. How are we doing? Well, are we in
Good.
sync?
I'm on plastic production by sector.
Production by sector. Terrific. So if you look at that, the main reason for showing this is that by industrial sector, the top sector that plastic is used for is with packaging. And a lot of that is food packaging. Next slide. So if you look at that graph, a very, very steep ascent. So by 2050, if you look at what the projected production of plastic will be, it's pretty both dramatic and frightening from my perspective. In last year, the Center for International Environmental Law, CIELS, produced two reports, one Plastic and Climate, that's one I'll talk about tonight, and one was called Plastic and Health. That's another area of my particular interests. The founder of that, Carol Moffett, said that if we're looking at climate change and the impacts of plastic on climate change, what we need to be doing is cutting emissions by almost 50% by 2030 in order to keep with the guidelines, the UN guidelines and the Paris Accords, but plastics particularly are poised to do exactly the opposite of that. And one of the things that their report pointed out was that as the Sierra Club and others have really focused the last number of years on closing coal-fired power plants. But if they are replaced by these crackers that take the ethane gas that is from fracked gas and turned into ethylene, which is the primary ingredient for making the plastic polypropylene, which becomes plastic packaging and plastic water bottles, among other plastic products, we are, rather than taking out from the environment those coal-fired power plants and reducing greenhouse gases from the reduction of coal fire, we're replacing or potentially replacing them by these cracker plants that could, by 2050, be the equivalent of 600 more of these coal-fired power plants. So that's kind of a frightening thought. So the question is, where is this very prolific plastic that's being produced, where is it being used? And I just think that some of these uses are so absurd. They're, you know, if it wasn't such a serious problem, they would make me laugh. But individual potatoes, all of these pictures are organic foods. So you take all that effort and trouble to actually grow food without so that it's safe without toxic chemicals, and then you wrap it in this plastic toxic product. And many of these products, like the bananas or cucumbers or the potatoes themselves, have perfectly natural coverings. So next slide, please. So this became a social media firestorm on Twitter in 2016, where Whole Foods had peeled oranges and then packaged them in plastic. And somebody posted that on Twitter, and Whole Foods saw it and said, oops, definitely our mistake. These have been pulled. We hear you, and we will leave them in their natural packaging, the peel. So next slide. So the problem with plastic is there just is no way. It gets created, and it takes hundreds and sometimes thousands of years for that plastic to disappear in the environment, and mostly it just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. So these numbers are pretty astonishing, and we see it as CL sees it, and a number of other organizations that work with us, as an urgent global crisis. Next slide, please. We definitely know that recycling isn't the answer. Earlier, I said that less than 9% of plastic has ever been recycled. And we have a fantastic mechanical engineer who does reports for us and with us. Her name is Jan Dell, and she actually took EPA numbers from 2015, which is where the 9.1% of the recycling rate nationwide comes from, and did projections based on closures of recycling centers and the China sword, which I'll mention in a minute, and looked at projections for 2018 and came up with 4.4%, less than half of that 9%. And 2019, she actually projected that those recycling rates would be 2.9%. So this generation of plastic is increasing worldwide, and some of you may be familiar with China's national sword, but in January of 2018, China said, you know what, the world had been, and the United States, Canada, many other what we would call first world countries, were shipping their containers that came over from east to west with goods that had been made in China and other countries in Southeast Asia, and then they would go back across the Pacific empty. So somebody got the bright idea, oh, well, you know, we'll fill them up with plastic, and then that cycle was bringing a lot of plastic into China, and they were then cleaning it. There was a lot of cottage industry, but it was growing and growing. So in January of 2018, they just said, no more, we're closing the doors. That has created a massive problem internationally with what is happening with plastic now. So next slide, please. And I encourage all of you on Earth Day this year, the story of plastic has documented in dramatic terms what has happened with that plastic post-China sword, post the national sword policy in China. There'll be conversation groups going on around the country with that, but the Discovery Channel will be premiering that on Earth Day. And I'm proud to say that Plastic Pollution Coalition is one of the producers of that film. Next slide, please. So what happens with a lot of that food? Yes, as Dana said, it ends up in landfill. So her numbers of about 40% of the food that ends up in landfills, I actually got that in an email today. But the EPA numbers, if you look them up from just the end of last year, they say it's 22%. So I would have loved to hear from Dana where she believes the EPA gets their numbers and how they are different, you know, how the accounting happens differently for the EPA than for this 40%. And take a look in the trash. I mean, this isn't anything that you haven't seen, overflowing with plastic water bottles, plastic packaging. Next slide, please. So we know that there are human health impacts from the plastic. The chemicals that are used in plastics to make them, to give them their flexibility and rigidity, are mimic endocrine activity in the body. And these are related to a variety of health problems, from cancers and infertility to obesity and diabetes. Curiously, and I will just put a marker in that for what we're going to talk about in a little bit, which is how does that impact the COVID health crisis we're dealing with now. But these are the underlying health concerns that are making individuals much more susceptible to serious cases of COVID. These health issues led a year ago summer the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists to both release statements around policy about reducing exposures to these chemicals, specifically in plastics. Next slide, please. We were part of an organizing group for a conference and a sponsor for a conference called Unwrapped, which was last June. And the primary organizers were one of our founding member organizations, Upstream, and and another founding member, the Food Packaging Forum out of Switzerland. So the issue was, what do we know about plastic wrapping food? There are studies that have been done around the potentially correlated health risks, but it's really important in science for us to look at what do we know, what don't we know, and how can we further our scientific knowledge. So what do we know? 12,000 chemicals are used in various forms of packaging and food contact material. We know these chemicals migrate from the packaging into the food and beverages. And just on the last slide, I said we know that these mimic the endocrine activity in the body. That's not good. And this reinforces other diseases that we know are implicated by these endocrine disrupting chemicals. So next slide, please. After the conference, a number of the major scientists that participated decided to develop a paper, and it focused on a declaration of concern about what should be happening to protect the public and the environment. And that specifically was to ensure that all chemicals used in food packaging are able to be traced and disclosed, because as we saw on the previous slide, many of these chemicals are not disclosed. The harmful chemicals need to be eliminated in all food packaging and not substituted with what are called regrettable substitutions. So the best example that I have that you may be familiar with is when there was a public uproar about bisphenol A being in babies' bottles. The manufacturers quickly switched, and even today you'll see bottles that say BPA free. Well, they substituted a different version of that chemical, because bisphenols are a chemical class, and there are substitutes like bisphenol S and bisphenol F and bisphenol E, and those have been tested and shown to be at least as bad as bisphenol A and sometimes worse. So that's a regrettable substitution. And we need to adopt policies that support the transition towards safe, reusable, and refillable packaging. Next slide, please. So these are some graphics that they produced as fact sheet for being able to share this information publicly, because a lot of people aren't going to read a scientific declaration of concern. So I'll move through these a little quickly. Next slide. And let's move on quickly to the next one, which is reduce chemical migration by understanding the principles. So that's why are these chemicals, these endocrine disrupting chemicals, migrating from the plastic wrap into the food that they're wrapping. So we know that higher temperatures help move that migration. That over time, if something, we say you have plastic water bottles and you've kept them in your trunk of your car because if there's an earthquake in our area, you want to be able to have that, or just for, you know, you're playing sports or whatever, and you want that in there. The heat sitting in the car and the time that those bottles have been sitting in your back seat are going to magnify the amount of leaching that happens into the water or whatever the container, whatever's in the container. Smaller packaging has are more problematic, and so avoiding these small packages would be important when you think about mothers providing those squeeze containers for their babies, organic, of course, and they put them in these problematic containers, and they're enhancing the leaching that's happening. I'm sure most of them have no idea that that's the case, and we know that fatty and acidic foods, so like French fries and things, those are more attractive to essentially pull the chemicals out. So moving on.
So you're basically saying, Sandra, the answer to what can we do is to avoid these situations and products with plastics. That's right? That's what this is.
Exactly. Make different choices.
Okay.
Yes, use reusables. Yes, definitely.
Okay. I'm on the picture with granite seeds now.
Yeah. So this one, food packaging is full of toxic chemicals. Probably a lot of us have, you know, when you go into the market today, this is what you see. In fact, I challenge all of you to walk into a supermarket today, and while there probably won't be any paper towels or toilet paper on the shelves, there probably still are these fruits and vegetables that are in these plastic clamshells. If you can buy the straight fruit and take the time, since everybody's at home, to cut up your cantaloupe and wash your grapes, a lot better for your health. Next slide, please. So moving on to, and again, I'm sorry that Dana's not there. She may have been involved with this NRDC report where they looked at types of food waste in 3 different cities, Nashville, Denver, and New York City. So you can see the distribution of what was the categories of waste and the proportions, with fruits and vegetables not probably a surprise being the highest amount, and then prepared foods and leftovers. Next slide, please. So if you go and look at plastic trash trends, the Ocean Conservancy and the International Coastal Cleanup have for many years been doing pickups, these cleanup reports, and plastic items like cigarette butts are always seem to be the top items, but you can take a look at what the other items include that are the top trash that's picked up on beaches internationally. Next slide, please. And what the dismal numbers for plastic recycling that I quoted before, roughly 9% from the EPA numbers from 2015, but probably more like less than 3% currently, are being sent to landfill because most people don't really know how to recycle and what is recycled, and also the markets for recycling have really diminished. Next slide, please. So the global movement Break Free from Plastic, which I mentioned earlier, has done a global brand audit last year, and they had one scheduled for this year in April, but they've postponed it for obvious health reasons right now. But what they looked at is, in addition to picking up the items that the Ocean Conservancy and the Coastal Cleanup did, they looked at brands. Who were the responsible brand owners for these items that were picked up? Next slide, please. So these were the top polluters.
Unfortunately, Sandra, that slide is not loading somehow, so you'll just have to tell us what it is.
Okay. So PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Mars, Unilever, Nestle, probably not a surprise to many of you. So let's see if the next slide will.
On how to reduce takeout packaging litter.
Yeah. So here's some ways that suggestions of what a restatement of many of the elements that I spoke about a little bit earlier. So let's move on. I see that time is clicking by quickly. Let's move on. Yeah. So the question is, what's to be done? Well, it's a multi-layered approach. Cleanup efforts, like I just mentioned, ongoing education and awareness building, supporting innovative product and materials, extended producer responsibility. That's if you make it, you're responsible for cleaning it up. Pepsi and Coke. A reduced dependence on fossil fuels, power the purse from consumers, and regulation. Let's move along. Lots of you will be aware of the many city, state, county, and businesses to take on reducing straws, plastic bags, styrofoam, and microbeads, microfibers. That will be coming next. Foodware, comprehensive approaches like the one that Berkeley passed last year that went into effect in January full-time. It's also, next slide please, moving on to the federal level. The Udall-Lowenthal Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act was introduced just this past February. The UN has a resolution for pledges for plastic reduction by 2030. And for those looking to have guidelines for how to take that on, Plastic Pollution Coalition worked in conjunction with a number of other organizations in our coalition to develop a global legislative toolkit. Industry, next slide please. Industry, of course, never rests, and they have been active in opposing bans. And we're going to move on quickly because this is the dirty truth about disposable foodware. This, again, will not surprise you, but they represent 8% in New York City. Next slide, please. 8% of the total trash that was picked up. So here's some suggestions. Vote with your meals, create policies, use reusables, and implement large-scale pilot projects. Next slide, please. So here we are, coronavirus. Everybody's saying, oh, we have to be really careful. Let's use plastic. That's the best thing that we can. That's the best thing that we can do. And so the plastic industry jumps on that and starts using that as a way to restrict bans and the implementation of bans. Next slide, please. Most recyclables are picked up and taken to the dump because haulers aren't going to mess around with any of that now. Next slide, please. The only study that actually was reported thus far shows that the coronavirus lives longest on plastic, 3 days, than any of these other materials. So the question that's being asked by people that I work with and in our focus on this problem is this the right solution? And next slide, please. Upstream, just 2 days ago, the question is, can you still bring reusables into the stores? Well, that's questionable at this point. Is that a good decision? Is it better to use plastic? Well, the virus lives longer on that than on reusables. We don't want to expose anybody, but is plastic really the answer? So the question, there needs to be more research. And the final slide is, I ask you, what do you think? If we use plastic, we increase the trash, which will have, and it's not going away, environmental and health consequences. If we don't, and we're not able to use reusables, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I will, there's my contact information. If there's a couple of questions that you want to pose while this ticks off, the time ticks off.
This was a fantastic presentation, really packed with information. Would it be possible for us to just share your slides so that people
Absolutely.
can
Absolutely. Yes, and what I've done is I've tried to give all the links.
Yeah, I see that. That's really helpful. This is really powerful, and it really brings home the cost of convenience and really the cost of instant gratification that we've come to just become habituated with. It's just, it's all this kind of embedded costs to health, costs to climate, costs to the whole ecosystem. So I guess maybe we'll take this as a segue to talk about next week. But Sandra, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
But next week we will talk about, we'll be with Anna LePay, who is a longtime leader in the food movement, and her most recent book, I think, is called Diet for a Hot Planet and What to Do About It. And she's going to zero in right now on COVID. And I want to take next week's class. We're going to actually embed a breakout in the middle of next week so that we can talk about what we might do as food systems change makers to think about shifting the reality coming out of this. What can we do? What will we pledge to do as student leaders, as community leaders, as people who are waking up to seeing the devastating impacts in our lifestyle that we've adopted in our country. So Anna will be with us to talk about sort of food in the moment of COVID, and also to go further with the topics that Dana and Dan and Sandra brought us tonight. So we are unfortunately running out of time. We appreciate you staying with us this evening, and we hope you'll stay safe. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and we'll see you next Wednesday night. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.